I'm Barrionuevo. I work with Maine Preservation. I'm the Programs and Real Estate Director, and I manage the Easements program. So as we get started, I just want to thank our sponsors. Without them, our mission would be difficult to fulfill. They help us get the job done every day, and you can see them here. Great businesses, all of them. So thank you to all of them for helping us out and making this happen. So most everyone is probably familiar with who we are, but Maine Preservation promotes and preserves historic places, buildings, downtowns, and neighborhoods, strengthening the cultural and economic vitality of Maine's communities. And we're going to talk about preservation of historic places today. So we're going to start with a poll, and I'm going to open this up to you all. I'm logged in from another device. My polling session isn't active. Oh, okay. Well, I was going to have a fun little poll for y'all to answer, but we're going to do it using the chat. So question number 1, because a structure is historic, it's automatically protected from destruction. If folks want to type in their answers, true or false, in the chat, we'll take a look. Excellent. Some good answers coming in. All right. So everyone knew the answer to that one. Good job. That's absolutely false. Our next question. If a building is listed in the National Register of Historic Places, an owner cannot demolish it. What do folks think about that one? One person wasn't quite clear. So the National Register of Historic Places is managed by the National Park Service, and properties that are considered significant for one or more reasons can be nominated by Maine State Historic Preservation offices, our office, as well as offices around the country. And if they're accepted, then it's an indicia of the value of that property to our national context. Most people said false, a couple said true, and it is actually false. So the National Register of Historic Places confers an imprimatur of value, of significance to the local, regional, state, or national communities. And can make the owner eligible for incentives for rehabilitation, such as tax credits, but it offers no actual protection from destruction. Our next question is, and this one comes up a lot here in Maine, so there are a lot of older homes and people ultimately decide to move on and sell them, and they make agreements with buyers. So think about this example. If I sell my special place and the buyer says they'll take care of it and they'll preserve it, this is enough to protect it? What do folks think about that? All right, good job, you guys. Everybody's on top of this. This is also false. And sadly, this actually came up in my local community. It wasn't actually a building, but it was a lot. And, the owner made an agreement with the buyer. The buyer said, oh, I'm never going to put a house on there because I'm going to put it in trust. As soon as, sadly, that person passed away, they put a 5,000 square foot house on the lot. So you guys did great. And it is true. So all these things are false. So how do we protect properties from destruction? And that's through a preservation easement. An easement is a legal enforceable document, and it is the only way that you can protect a property in perpetuity from adverse action or demolition in the future. So let's talk a little bit about easements. So an easement program enables a qualified tax-exempt charitable organization or a public agency, such as the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, to protect buildings or land against potential adverse development or changes by taking an interest in the property, a partial interest. So if you think about real estate as the bundle of sticks, that's how lawyers think about it. You have the right to possession, the right to transfer. There's a little set of sticks, and an easement takes a piece, like one of the twigs, out of the bundle and gives it to a good friend for a purpose, and here it is for protection. So Maine Preservation is such a charitable organization that's qualified to accept easement donations, and we do have a program. So other organizations that can take easements are, like I said, the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, Historic New England. Organizations have to be qualified to do so, and most states have at least one, and in Maine we are that entity. So what is an easement? Let's talk a little bit about that. So it's voluntary, right? No one can force you to give up a piece of your of your bundle of sticks, except for possibly the government through eminent domain, but that's outside of the scope of today's discussion. So it's a legal instrument. It's a contract between the owner of a property and our organization in this instance, because we're going to talk about us here in Maine. The owner grants an interest in their property rights to our organization to protect the property. It's often referred to as an easement deed. It's also referred to as an agreement. It is a document that is binding, it's notarized, and it's recorded in the County Registry of Deeds to run with the land, as they say. It becomes part of the deed package that a property is subject to in the future. So it just works like it works just like a conservation easement or a utility right of way. You know, there's multiple documents that may appertain to a single parcel of land, and that's what title search is all about. So when you sell a property and you engage a title search, you know, an attorney goes through and makes sure that they've identified all of the legal documents that convey or convert interests in property in a parcel to one or more people. Alexis, it sounds like you have a question. You could ask it now if you want, or you could wait to the Q&A. It's really up to you. If you want to put it in the chat window, one of my team members will probably break in and ask the question to me at a good stopping point. So if you want to just type it in there, that would be great.
Yes, we'll definitely keep an eye on the chat
in this
box.
case, a preservation easement is going to establish perpetual protection for the property to prevent inappropriate changes from being made to the structure or its setting. So it's fairly rigid in some of its attributes, but it's custom tailored to each property and circumstance. And what that means is it depends on the property. For most properties here in Maine and around the country, exterior easements are what you usually see. Protection of the exterior attributes, the things that the public can see. In some cases where a property is particularly significant, say you had a museum quality house where the entire interior dated to 1765 and it hasn't been touched since. Well, that might be pretty fantastic and something that the owner might want to protect as well. Interior easements are more restrictive and on the owners, future owners. When you think about them 1,000 years from now, if the house, you know, didn't sadly burn down or something like that, you know, it could become constrictive over time. So those are kind of reserved for special situations, but exterior easements are pretty common, right? You know, don't change the outside look of this house because I want to keep it the way it looks now. So in consultation with owners, we kind of come up with description of what's protected and the level to which it's protected, because there's also concepts of prohibitions and permissions with authorization. But we always look to in our easements to make sure that the document is flexible enough to allow the homeowner, property owner, in the case of a commercial business, to make changes and updates, such as additions and alterations, to make sure that the house evolves through time and continues to be useful. If someone can't use the house and function and use it as a building, that's not a good thing for the building ultimately, right? So we want to make sure that the property continues to evolve over time. And ultimately, the reason you do it is obviously to provide assurance that this property is going to be preserved for future generations, to make sure it's not lost due to inattention, neglect, and you know, actual bad actions. And we'll call them bad actions. They're not necessarily bad, but in the context of we want to protect the building, we'll say that tearing it down is a bad thing. So let's think about it a little bit broadly. So properties to benefits to the property owners. So you've got peace of mind. I mean, number one, right? This document runs with the land. It says you can't tear it down. Future owners see that in the chain of title. So they are alerted immediately that the house has restrictions, or I'm going to use house, but it could be a commercial property. That there are protections in place and that this house is going to be, you know, subject to those protections. So maybe if you're planning on tearing it down, this is not the right house for you. I always refer back to Scott Hansen's presentations on modernizing your old home for contemporary uses, and his webinar is available on our website if you want to take a look at that. You know, he has this very powerful statement, you know, don't force your lifestyle into the house, right? Choose the house that's right for your lifestyle. And an easement deed would give a, you know, a future potential buyer the flag that maybe this is not the house for you. If that's, if they don't like the way it looks now, that's not going to be a good fit for them. Other benefits to property owners that you'll see, we offer free technical assistance from our field services manager and other staff members to the holder of a property that's subject to an easement deed. So when they need to replace their siding, or they're having trouble with their windows, or they're thinking about paint, they can call on us for consultation and assistance and referrals to professionals. So that's something that we offer at no charge to our easement property owners. The third one is tax relief. So there are a couple ways that tax relief can come into play. So there's a charitable deduction for the easement stewardship contribution that we're going to talk a little bit about during the course of this presentation. And there's also potential income tax deductions for the value of the easement itself. So the concept of conferring, taking a little twig out of that bundle of sticks and giving it to someone else, in some cases could result in a diminution of value of the property itself. This comes up a lot in like conservation easements. When you put your land in a conservation easement, you're giving up a lot of development rights, and that generally is considered to reduce the market value of a property. On the preservation easement side, the diminution in value is typically not very much, especially for most homes here in Maine. It could be large if you're looking at a large estate down east, but actually but successfully claiming the deduction in value without being audited by the IRS is something you'd want to talk to a tax attorney about. There was a DC based organization that in the early 2000s undertook taking a bunch of easements in Georgetown. You can read all about it in the newspaper if you want to learn more about this. But basically the IRS got wind of this because people started filing serious deductions in their property value. I mean, we're talking huge, like 40-50% is deduction in property value. And the IRS is like, audit them all. And so that's not going to fly, and actually has put out, so, there's been a number of cases on this matter. You're definitely an audit risk if you take one of these deductions. And the other piece that's really problematic is that the appraisal industry has largely gotten out of doing appraisals for this diminution in value due to this issue. So it's out there. No one in Maine that I know of has taken advantage of it. And from other states, I'm not hearing a lot of folks doing this anymore just because it's really risky. But it is out there. Like I said, I mean, it's on the books as something that Congress, wants to encourage. So consult your tax professional if you think that this is something that you might be interested in. Okay. So I think we're going to hold that question till the end. But thanks for that question out there. And folks, you could see it in the chat. So let's move on. So I kind of alluded this a little bit about it already. So taking that twig out of the bundle, right? So how are the owner's rights affected? So the owner of a home or any kind of property that is subject to a preservation easement retains all of their rights to do anything they want, except the right to damage or destroy the subject of the easement, which is typically the house and the surrounding grounds. Attached barns are often covered. We'll talk a little bit about levels of coverage in a little bit. But and when I mean surrounding grounds, it's usually like the area right around the house, right? So digging quarries in the front yard. Is a typical one. No ash dumps, no creating giant garbage dumps in your yard are things that we would typically see in a preservation easement. And these are in place really just to protect the view and the view of the home to the public, which is part of the public purpose of taking a preservation easement, and actually protecting the home from potential damage from adverse things happening in the area right around the house. So the an owner of a home that's subject to a preservation easement has certain duties. So they got to maintain the property, right? Take care of it, keep it up to the standard at which it was at the time that the easement was taken. Cooperate with monitoring. And we'll talk a little bit about monitoring in a moment. Consult with us, Maine Preservation, on proposed changes to the covered structure. So like I said, an easement is not designed to typically lock the building into a period of time and no changes could ever happen to it again. You might want to put on an addition. You might want to put in, typically an addition, new doors, windows, roof, whatever it is. when changes like that come up that are part of those changes affect the covered part of the structure, the owner is required to come to Maine Preservation and talk to us about what they want to do and get sign off. And typically, and we work with them and give them advice, and then we ultimately sign off on their approach and help them make that happen. So we're talking about alterations and improvements and additions. You're going to want to make sure that the historic features aren't adversely affected. That's what we really look at, and that we're, planning and reviewing those changes in advance. Those changes can happen, but they just need to be supervised. And then the work is actually done in conformance with what they agreed to do. And then the last piece is public access, visual access from the road typically for exterior easements. So easements, part of the concept here is that it's, protecting it for future generations for the public benefit, right? So that people can really enjoy the beautiful buildings that kind of tie us back, right, contextually to our history. So visual access is, except where it's way off the road, is typically going to be maintained. So no planning, 30-foot high hedges or fences to block the view. And if an interior easement is contemplated, access by the public to the interior is required. That's, on cooperation and on a, orderly basis, right? It's calendared and it can be limited to professionals and students, but that's a requirement for an interior easement. Again, back to public benefit. If we're protecting the inside but no one can see it, it doesn't really confer much value. And so, let's go to the next slide. So our duties, I mentioned monitoring. So we have a duty to monitor all the easements that we have in our portfolio once a year. Right now is the timetable that we go and visit them on. So we go out and actually visit the properties, look at the exterior, look at the condition, compare it to the baseline photographs that are taken as part of the easement formation. And if it's an interior easement, we go into the house as well to review those interior features to make sure that they're doing well as well. We love to have the owner present, even if it's just an exterior walk around, to talk to them about how their house is doing, about potential projects, and give them information that they might need. And then that comes with the teeth. So an easement, a preservation easement is an enforceable agreement, as I mentioned. And if a homeowner or property owner is, deemed to not be in conformance with the terms of the easement, say they're no longer taking care of the property, or they've put that, they're thinking of, they got a backhoe in the yard, maybe they're looking to put that quarry in the front yard, unlikely, but maybe, we, under the terms of the easement, we have the ability to take legal action to enforce the terms of the easement and make sure that the owner does right by the property. Those are the big duties that we undertake as part of the process. And okay, so Alexis, so we did have a question. Are the owner's duties part of Maine law, or is this fairly universal? For example, I've never heard of the two-time access rule in Massachusetts. The two-time access rule is actually is tied to the IRS for tax purposes. There's a public benefit concept there, and that's going to be pretty universal for an interior easement. I'd be surprised if it wasn't there. For exterior, it's not required, but for an interior, it would be. But the owner's duties would be, I would say they're pretty standard. What I just described to you is what's in every easement that I've seen, and that's probably from about 10 states, as well as the National Trust for Historic Preservation's model easement, which many of the easements around the country are modeled on. But I'm not going to say categorically, because easements can differ in terms of in terms of their level of restrictiveness and flexibility. And we've also been talking here about easements in perpetuity, and there is also the concept of termed easements, where, and this is often the case, where you'll get a grant from an entity and you enter into an easement relationship for a period of years, say like 10, 25 years. And then after that, the easement would actually term out and end. So that's a good question. I mean, if you're interested in that 2x access piece, which is always a little bit thorny, I mean, it's something I'm going to be investigating. but that's the answer I have for you today. So hang on, there's a couple more questions here that I'm going to take. So let's see. Just wanna...
So, Alexis's.
Have you taken, oh, and so Alexis had another question. Have you taken any legal action to enforce any? Not here in Maine. Generally, this enforcement engagements, I mean, I'm going to call them engagements, are pretty rare. We've never had one here. And I've talked to, other organizations around the country, like, for example, Landmarks Illinois, which has over 600 easements. They got, and the reasons for that we won't talk about here. But they told me with those 600 easements in the last, I want to say 10, 15 years, they'd only had 2 cases where they actually had to go to court. It's just, most people purchasing a property that's subject to a preservation easement are going to be on board with the purpose of the easement. I mean, you're buying, for example, this picture here at the Cosmopolitan Club in Bath that's subject to a preservation easement because you like the way this property looks and you want to take care of it and make sure that it's, preserved and not only preserved, but possibly enhanced right into the future. So enforcement actions are going to be pretty rare. They're not going to not happen, but like I said, we haven't had any here. Let's see, we have a couple other comments coming in here. I'm not sure what that one means, so we're going to table that for a moment. Would an easement protect a house from eminent domain by the government? So that's an interesting question, and it's going to be a partial yes. I'm not a legal expert in this area, but a governmental entity is subject to other regulations around historic, interactions with historic properties. So Section 106, if you've heard of that, would come into play in that context of, and they could potentially take the property, but they would have to show, give a good reason for why they were going to take an adverse action against it. This is the case where a National Register listing does confer some benefit. It doesn't protect a private owner from tearing a house down, but a governmental entity is subject to some restrictions when they're interacting with historic properties. I don't know if Greg's on the line, he might want to speak to that because he's had much longer experience in the field than I have and may have, come across this in action. Section 106 ultimately doesn't prevent a government, the federal government from tearing a building down, but it makes it pretty difficult, right? They have to show some good reasons. So, if they're taking a property by eminent domain, this is me just talking off the cuff, they might be able to take an adverse action against an historic property, because if they're taking the property, in theory, there's a really good reason that they're doing so. But I don't have any experience, like I don't know of any cases, and I am sure they are actually probably out there to speak to that authoritatively. That's a really good question. Thank you for that. What if the property burns down? So if the property burns down, there is, so burns down, 100% loss, the preservation easement is extinguished. It ends because there's no purpose to the easement anymore. If it's a partial loss, the easement has a process by which an evaluation is made as to the level of loss and whether it's worth rebuilding. That gets it pretty technical, but partial loss, the easement may survive, but if it totally burns down, the easement would end because the building is gone. There's an obligation to rebuild, a make-believe house that looks like it did before. You could do that with your insurance funds, obviously if you chose to, but it wouldn't be required. Would there be easements in local protected historic districts? So if you are in a local historic district, that your inclusion as a contributing structure within such a district confers potentially the level of protection that you would need. So, if your house is in an historic district, you wouldn't necessarily need a preservation easement as well. It depends on, what the historic district says. You would not typically be eligible, I want to say, for, that federal tax deduction that I was describing on the property diminution in value if it's in the district, because that's kind of already happened as part of its inclusion in the district. So next question is, what's the ballpark figure for the legal fees involved in obtaining a preservation easement? I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So I'll get back to your question, John. So I think I got everyone's questions here. Just want to make sure.
I think there was one more question from Alexis from before.
So eligibility for the program. Lots of gray houses in Maine. Here's some lovely ones that are in our portfolio. So to be eligible for an easement donation, it's any kind of property, but the property has to be considered significant in some fashion, either at the local, regional, or national level. And it doesn't mean it's a museum. It could be important because of its relationship to important people or important actions or, interesting stories, right? That it's all about the place, right? Being evocative of something that's important to the community. And typically for historic properties, it kind of ties you back and gives you context to the continuity of history of an area, right? But at its base level, when we think about it logically, it's typically going to be one of these three things. So it's property that's already listed in the National Register, or it's deemed eligible for inclusion. And that is eligibility for inclusion is an actual, I'm trying to not use a legal term for it. It's an actual criteria, level of significance. So the State Historic Preservation Commission puts a stamp on it and says, yes, this is eligible. It's it's not listed on the register, but it's in an historic district and it's listed as property to that district. So, if you ever take a look at a National Register Historic District nomination form, which I recommend, it's super fun, and they're easily obtained from the National Park Service on their website. It'll list all the properties within the district that are deemed contributing. It'll have, their address, the name of the building, when it was built, and information about it. And that's how you'll know if you're already in there. And then that third one is kind of what I was referring to at the outset. It's identified as an important historic or cultural resource. It's not on any list, but it's the place, right? It's, the place in town. It's the place in your community that, is valuable to you for a reason. And that is worth, protecting and preserving into the future. So how does the process work? And this is how the process would actually work with us here at Maine Preservation. It would literally be you reaching out to us and saying, I'm interested. That starts the conversation. We would talk a little bit about your property, learn about, its age and why you find it important or your community finds it important. We do a little preliminary research to make sure it's worth, following through the, kind of stepping into the process, the formal process of potentially entering into an easement with the owner. There's an application that we would share with you, and you would provide us with essential information that we need for research, like its deed, book and page, numbers. I mean, we can get all that, but it's much easier if you provide it to us, along with background information and photos of the house, and an application fee, which covers the time that we take to invest in actually doing this research, but it returns to you. Ultimately, if you choose to go through with an easement with us, and I will talk a little bit about, how that works. It is applied towards the final charitable stewardship contribution. And it also comes with a 1-year membership with our organization. You're helping support our mission, which is really great. With that kickoff, we would actually, engage in some deep eligibility research, and actually start talking legal terms with you, and in terms of, what do you want protected? What do we think needs to be protected? Kind of scope what that looks like out, and kind of get a feel for that. And then it's presented this package, right? this building is presented to the board of our organization for them to approve, you know, to make sure that there are sage eyes on this, because it is actually, you know, a burden that's being taken on by our organization in perpetuity, you know, for forever. So we need to make sure that the board of our organization is on board with us and feels that it's appropriate for us to undertake that obligation. When that happens, if approval happens, then we may have already been outside, but we will come out and actually do what's called baseline documentation, which is where we photograph the entire structure, and with details, images taken of the features and attributes that are going to be covered, but we'll also take pictures of the entire, you know, the entire property, and views of landscapes and other buildings on the property, so that there's a good record, for the future to see what the property looked like at the time of the easements formation, so that there's something to compare with in the future during those annual monitoring actions that I described that we would be taking. Ultimately, there would be the charitable easement stewardship contribution. The remaining balance would be made at or before, I mean, we're welcome funds to support the easement at any time, and then ultimately the recording of the easement itself. So there's some fees there, but basically everything's signed with a notary and then it's recorded. So when I referenced the contribution, so what is this for? So the easement stewardship contribution goes into a pooled legal defense fund, as well as monitoring. So we do a 20-year amortization of, you know, what the monitoring costs look like each year, and that fee, you know, the fee supports that monitoring on an annual basis, as well as goes into just a reserved account to in the event that an enforcement action is required, which, like I said earlier, is unlikely. But if one does happen, you would go through the funds pretty quickly. Legal fees are not cheap, especially, you know, in litigation. If that was ultimately required, you'd hope that it wouldn't be. And I think, like I said, it's very rare that a case would actually go to litigation because you've worked it out beforehand, in almost every case. But if a court case was required, the costs are very high. So that's where the stewardship contribution goes. And the recording costs, you know, that varies by easement, varies by jurisdiction, pardon me. So one of the questions that someone asked, what were the actual costs of the legal fees? So the recording fee, you know, varies. I don't think that that's too much. It's a good question. I haven't looked since the last time I recorded on my own house, but it's in the hundreds. Legal fees will vary based on, you know, if you were engaging with us to enter into an easement. We do the easement documentation ourselves, and sometimes in consultation with an outside attorney if it's a novel situation. You on your own behalf probably would typically engage an attorney just to make sure that you feel comfortable with what you're doing. And those fees are going to vary based on, you know, who you're working with. So I can't really speak with, you know, kind of authority. It really depends on, you know, how much your lawyer charges by the hour and whether you go by the hour or a flat fee or you're doing it yourself. So that's going to vary. But that's a good question though. Okay, so, good question. So what happens if our Maine preservation or whoever holds an easement goes under or ceases to exist? Well, hopefully we wouldn't go under or cease to exist. But in the case that happened, the legal document says that, and part of the dissolution of Maine preservation would be to effect this transfer. The easements would be transferred to another organization or entity that is qualified to hold such easements. So, you know, off the top of my head, it'd probably be the Maine Historic Preservation Commission would take them at least temporarily until another qualified organization made itself available to take the easements. So, part of the wind down of an organization, you know, of Maine preservation, which isn't going to happen, but say it did, would be for the board to, you know, make that transition happen. But that's a great question. but that is contemplated by the easement. So do preservation groups that hold easements have a legal defense fund insurance set up like land trust? We don't. I can't speak to other states. If Greg is here, he might be able to speak to that. I'm guessing probably, for very large entities, when I think about the National Trust or Historic New England, they probably do. So Greg, if you're on, feel free to chime in at any point.
Sure.
So next question.
Ally?
Yes.
Yeah. I've got a few points, so
Yeah.
made a little list here.
Mm.
First of all, relative to the tax deduction, I think Ally's made this clear, but when she was talking about getting audited, if you don't include your property value, we don't know of any audits that have taken place. It's only when there's a
Oh,
property
yeah.
value,
I'm sorry. Thank you, Greg. Yeah, no,
that's
it's
diminished. That there have been audits on preservation easements. So it really applies to that particular case. And as she mentioned, it's a relatively small deduction anyway, generally in Maine. Relative to local historic districts, they can be subject to the politics of the community. So even if, and there aren't a lot of communities that have strong local ordinances in Maine, but if your community is, even if your community is one, it could go away at some point. So noting the easement is a way for you to assure that it will be preserved, whatever happens with the politics. Although I must say, in general, local historic districts get stronger rather than weaker. That's not always the case, but that is generally the case.
That's a great
But
point.
just something for you to consider, and particularly to look at the particulars, because some local districts simply delay demolition for maybe 180 days, but don't actually restrict it. The condemnation piece, a question that came up earlier, I think Ally was absolutely correct on that. That Section 106 is really kind of a weak law, and it only applies when federal funds or federal licensing is involved. So if there was a condemnation that involved federal funds, yes, Section 106 would apply, but it does not actually prevent a demolition from occurring. So if the agency that's seeking to do the action wants to follow through on 106 and say, yeah, we get it, we document it, here it is, but they can go ahead and demolish. So, in a case of condemnation, you're not necessarily protected by the easement. I would say that it would be an argument that you could make that this building has been recognized and so forth, and it is important, but it wouldn't necessarily carry the day legally. It would be more like a political judgment, I would suggest. And legal fees, what was the question there?
The legal defense fund insurance setup.
Oh, yeah. That's something.
Jim said there's a national legal defense fund.
Yeah, that is something that the Land Trust Alliance, a national organization, has negotiated. So they've secured that for land trusts, but it does not, or it has not as of yet applied to historic preservation ordinances. So, unfortunately, it's not a bad idea. There probably are enough of them. There were an underwriter, but that has not been undertaken nationally. And then I have a note about contributing properties, but I'll be darned if I can remember what that was about.
I don't know.
Let's see.
Protections?
Contributing properties, I know what it was, Ally. Your sound checked out when you said it. So the idea is if you have a National Register district, it lists each property as either a contributing property or a non-contributing property. So what you want is a contributing property in a National Register historic district. So.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Cool. All right, keep those questions coming. All right. So that was kind of the process. We have an additional layer here at Maine Preservation, and it's called Protect and Sell. So we're taking it to the next level. So we do easements, but if for special properties, we'll actually get involved in sales management. Basically, we will become involved as a partner for the owner that's looking to sell a property to find a new preservation-minded owner, a buyer for the property, and then execute the easement as well as potentially a rehabilitation agreement as part of that sales transaction to that new buyer. So we've done 7 of these. We've been involved in 7 transactions since 2014 when this program was instituted, which is part of my time. And basically, for the most part, they've been properties that are a little bit challenged, right? Rehabilitation is contemplated as part of the package, right? The property's not in great shape. The owner wants to move it on, wants to protect it, but move it on to an owner that can actually do the rehabilitation because they're unable or unwilling to for some reason. They're possibly just looking to get out of the property. So what we do in that case is basically look to match buyers with sellers, right? We'll facilitate the marketing and sale and the protection of the property. And again, goes back to the easement. Excuse me. Guarantee peace of mind, right? At the end of the day, that the property is being protected. So how do we do this? We basically start with securing an option to purchase the property. That enables us to work on the owner's behalf as someone who has an interest in the transaction. And then we act as the liaison into the real estate marketplace. We'll engage the real estate agent and we'll work with that professional to market and sell the property. And basically, take that off of your hands and look for a new preservation-minded owner. We'll take all the potential buyers through what's going on with this property, what the rehabilitation requirements are going to look like, right? Because part of this transaction, if the rehabilitation is required, is we'll enter into an agreement with them for them to actually do the work. It's a binding contract that they have to repair the property. And we'll talk to them about the easement and work with them on that. And then we handle that up through closing. And at closing, the option of purchase is transferred. The easement is recorded along with the rehabilitation agreement if it's needed. Excuse me, I'm so sorry, you guys. So that's what that's all about. And, potential partners or basically this list. It is anyone who pretty much owns a property. Historical societies, lands trusts, towns. We work with towns. Excuse me. Estate situations, that can often come up, especially where the house has become owned by many, many, many people over time. And then all those people need to get out of that property for one reason or another. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Coughing. So a little bit about our easements. So this is the current portfolio that Maine Preservation holds. You can see they're mainly clustered in the lower half of the state, but we've got a beauty way down east. And they run the gamut from very early to 1906, which is the Grand Trunk Railroad Station in Yarmouth, which we were involved in. That property was part of the Protect and Sell program. A variety of styles. And so what I thought I would do to kind of close out is kind of take you through a couple easements so that you can kind of see, we're not going to look at the legal documents, don't worry. We're going to look at a couple properties and talk just a little about the protections that are on them to show how they might differ. And these are the 3 that we'll take a look at one by one. So the first is the Sabbath Day Lake Shaker Village, which if you haven't been there, post-COVID, please go out and visit. It's really a magical place. It's so beautiful and peaceful, and they're doing great work there to preserve these properties and actually continue to evolve them because it is an active working place. There are still a few Shakers living there and working there. So this easement is quite large. It covers 19 buildings, and it covers the exteriors of those buildings and the interiors on a couple of the very significant buildings, including the meeting house. So the exterior protections Contemplate all the facades, the doors, the frames, the windows, the sashes, the casings, the shutters, the hardware, right? So what that means is all those things have to be maintained. And if they want to make alterations and some, I mean, we're going to talk about the special case of the Shakers in a second, but as an easement, they would have to maintain those items. And if they needed to repair them and if they wanted to make changes to them, they would have to approach Maine Preservation about getting permission to make those changes. And we would consult with them on how to do it sympathetically. And I mentioned the interior, so of high significance. So it actually includes, the plaster walls, the woodwork, the paneling, the chimneys. I mean, it's very extensive. I mean, the list is it's like a laundry list, right? Pretty much these buildings in their entirety, right? Which is really, really comprehensive. But this is, at the one end of the extreme. And this one also covers landscapes. So in addition to close surroundings of the house, I mean, there are restrictions around what can be done in the view, anything that's in the viewscape around the buildings themselves. And there's also a duty to maintain plantings of vegetation and screenings in relationship to what they looked like at the time of the easement being formed, or in keeping with the historical records. So pretty restrictive, because it is so important, and that the owners wanted this to happen to make sure, into the future, into perpetuity, when, as most of you know, Shakers are really in decline. If they don't get more members, eventually this will just become a museum, and they want to make sure that it's protected regardless of what happens to I mean, definitely, if they are no longer there to steward this property, to make sure that it's taken care of. And I did mention this one was actually a special case. So the Shakers, while they are living and using this property, have certain freedoms that would not be permitted to future owners of the property if it did become a museum. And that's in recognition of the fact that it is an active living community right now. The next property to take a look at is the railroad depot, which I just mentioned. If you have not been by Yarmouth to see this beautiful building, I recommend it. It's a bank, so you can go in and actually see it. Maybe you don't want to until post-COVID again, but it's lovely. And this property was part of our protect and sell program, and was also subject to a rehabilitation agreement as part of it, because it had been it was in actually great shape, but we wanted to make sure that it was, that the changes that were going to be made to it were respectful. I think that that's true. I may have misspoken on there was an agreement, because again, this predates me, but we did supervise the alterations that were made to the property as part of its transition from really what was a depot, as a beautiful building that had been largely untouched by its careful stewards, into a bank structure, right? And they did a great job with how they made that happen. So this one is an interior and exterior, excuse me, I'm so sorry, an interior and an exterior easement, and additions are clearly contemplated, and they're actually marked out in the agreement where they can put additions. So this one was fairly specific. And with in consultation with our organization, they could actually make changes to the structure and also add signs and make topographical, excuse me, changes to the land, putting in the roads, parking lot, and whatnot. I'm so sorry. And then finally, Harriet Beecher Stowe House, which is a great building in Brunswick. This one's only on the exterior. So inside, as long as it doesn't affect the exterior, like you can't take out like the corner wall so the house falls down, or do terrible things to the foundation that causes the collapse. I mean, you have to maintain the structural elements that hold the building up. But other than that, you can do what you want inside. This one actually has an express prohibition on adding any dormers or skylights, which was kind of an interesting item. And I wasn't involved in this agreement, so I'm not sure where that came from. But permitted, or again, additions, making changes, planting new trees. I think that was contemplated possibly at the time that this agreement was made. And in this case, this was kind of interesting carve outs. The owner could take out signs, replace the signs as long as they do something similar, and actually change or replace their HVAC equipment without consultation with us. And I'm thinking that's probably because it's already on site, but I don't have the background information on that to share with you right now. So that is the presentation. So that's the team. I'm Allie, and this is the rest of the staff who I think many of you have been on our webinars before, but Greg's our director. Jonathan Hall's our field services manager. He's the gentleman that will be out in the field talking with our easement whole property owners about projects that they might have, things that they want to do, questions that they have about getting assistance on repairs and tools, technologies, and materials. That's what's going on. So if you're interested in doing an easement, you contact me to get started. And that's my email address. It's really easy, allie@mainepreservation.org. And I am going to open it up for more questions at this point. And I'm sorry, I was coughing. Okay, so we did have some questions. Are these on your website, the ones for sale? And Anna did reply to everyone. So right now we don't have any properties for sale. We do list our protect and sell properties on our website, so you can see, the kinds of properties that we have done since 2014. And then I think our full easement list is probably somewhere on the website as well. But a number of them are private homes, so we, it's not a secret, but we don't necessarily, shout it to the trees. That makes sense. So anyone have any questions? You could unmute yourself and ask a question if you want. And I'm so sorry, I'm coughing. I've got a tickle. Okay, so we did have a question. So the typical stewardship contribution, right now that's $25,000. And again, excuse me, that supports the monitoring of the of the property in perpetuity. It's amortized over, take that down over 20 years. And then the pooled legal defense fund, it's a restricted fund that's used for legal defense.
I have a question if you can
Any other
take
questions?
Oh, it looks like Joan Beal might have a question.
Okay.
Yes, okay, maybe you can't see me, I had my hand up. If you are, you can take on easements, and Maine Historic Preservation Commission take on easements. What other, this is two parts, what other charitable organizations are there in Maine that would be qualified to do that? That's one of my parts. The other thing is, if you didn't take it, what would be the likelihood that if your board decided not to take on the easement role, that Maine Historic Preservation Commission would? I mean, you must have all very similar criteria.
Yeah. Okay. So for the so Dan Steve is actually right. So Historic New England, I don't know how active they are in taking easements at this point. Their portfolio is pretty big at this point, but they're another organization that's active in New England and Maine. They have properties around Maine. So that'd be a question to them. I know that I believe they still listed on the website, but I'm not sure how aggressively they're actually looking at that. If we chose not to take, the board's declined to take an easement, would Maine Historic Preservation Commission take the easement? Greg, I'm going to defer to you on this. I feel like that they're mostly doing easements in terms of, in relation to the grants that they give of funds, federal funds or state funds, but I'm not 100% sure. So Greg, maybe you can.
Yes, I think that is true. But it has to be involved somehow in general with their work. And I don't think they have any perpetual easements. I think they just have term easements, mostly due to grants that they have given in the recent past.
I mean, and I think other than Historic New England, I'm not aware of any other. I mean, there might be a local group, but I don't think so.
No, I don't know of another. And I think Historic New England's stewardship contribution is about in the $50,000 range. In general, they have a whole number of more than 50 historic houses that they own and operate. And so in general, they're looking for, kind of museum quality type buildings rather than, the sort of day-to-day buildings of Maine or other states in which they operate. It's a very good group, though, really, really good group. So I don't want to be sounding like I'm, talking them down.
So Maggie had a question. Do most of your easement opportunities come through field service calls or elsewhere? I'd say probably they're not necessarily field service calls, but they're definitely inquiries for help, right? There's something going on and, they reach out to us or we get to know them through field service contacts. Since I've only been with the organization about 1.5 years, and I would say probably 65-70% have come through that, consultation and just a relationship, which could be longstanding. Jonathan started a few months after I did, but our previous field services manager, Chris Kloss, was with the organization for 10 years and he has great records, and he would meet with people quite regularly over over that decade. And then at some point, during the relationship, that people decided that they might, they wanted to move on. And or just engage in protection. I mean, the folks that I'm talking with about easements now are typically people that are planning at some point in the future to transfer their property to new owners. We have several trust relationships where, there are multiple owners of a single property of quite high significance. And they're eventually probably at the end of this generation of ownership planning to dissolve their trusts and sell the property outside so that the funds from that sale could go to the different parties and that they move on their separate ways. As owners, typically through descendant, right, ownership, parents pass it to the kids, it becomes, more and more diffuse, right? And there, could be 5-10 owners of a single property and their interests are not necessarily aligned, just due to time. And so in preparation for that, eventual transfer is when we get called about potentially doing an easement to make sure the property is protected when it leaves that family's ownership. So Martha asked, I represent a 501c3 organization who signed a 10-year easement. Hi, Martha. I think you're out at the Lamb House, right?
Yes.
When given a grant from the Belvedere Historic Preservation Grant in 2016, the windows were replaced. In 1960, including the storms, can we replace these rather than restoring them? So the windows are dated to 1960. Yeah, Greg, I'm going to ask you to chime in here, but those are not historic windows. I mean, I would obviously consult with your funder, but I think you can replace those. Sorry.
Yeah, the easement holder is who makes the determination. So if it's Maine Historic Preservation Commission, it really would be best to ask them that question. But I think Allie's guess is correct, although the National Register criteria is 50 years old or older. So actually, even though they're 1960, they are significant. True. But one of the perils of replacement windows is simply this: that if you really want a tight window, most of them last only about 10 years, whatever the warranty may read. This is what people tell us. Some cases maybe 20, some cases longer. But you do get to a point with many of these windows that they simply have to be replaced. The more contemporary ones are maintenance free. And what that means is if they have a problem, you can't fix them. So you do have to replace those. They call themselves maintenance free, but it has a double meaning. So that's a long answer to a short question, but I think the answer would be go to Maine Historic Preservation Commission and ask them. And I would think in many cases they would say yes.
Particularly if they're vinyl. Because the house dates to, I want to say late 1700s, early 1800s. So if they're vinyl, you're probably,
1850s.
that's earlier. I got your house confused, your building confused with another one, but yeah. So there's vinyl in
thank
there.
you.
You might be in good shape. Okay. Does anybody else have any questions? And again, I'm sorry, I was coughing. Well, if you think of something afterwards, feel free to email us or just email me directly, ally@mainepreservation.org, and I will try and get an answer for you. Before we break, I want to let you know about upcoming events. So we hopefully will have something in January as well. But right now, our next scheduled event is February, and this is going to be a really exciting session. Michael Gobelbane from the Maine Historic Preservation Commission is going to come and give us an introduction to the National Register of Historic Places, which we talked about today, and about the commission's work. You're going to find out about the register, how it works, what the eligibility criteria are, how the process for listing works. And he'll also give us a quick survey of the listed properties and their areas of significance and their geographic distribution, which is pretty cool. I mean, you saw our easement list, which kind of tracks population clustering. I would love to see us get more places down east, but their list is very diffuse, so it's all over the state, and it's pretty exciting to see. And there are, of course, districts all over the state as well. So please sign up for that one. The registration's on our website, and we'll be sending around in our upcoming newsletters as well. But that's gonna be a great session. So with that, I'll say thank you. And if you liked what you heard and you want to support the mission, we welcome your support on our website. You can click easily and find a way to drop us a dime. And I think we might have a question. So hang on. Oh, you were just saying thank you. So I was hoping there were more questions. But with that, unless anyone has anything else, Greg, I don't know if you are still on, if you had anything you wanted to say. Otherwise, I thank everyone as well and let them continue with their day. Thanks, everyone, and have a great evening, and take care.